Today's topic is crime scene photography, and we're going to learn some do's and don'ts when you're photographing a crime scene. There's a very heavy emphasis on crime scene photography because we know that testimonial evidence is faulty. When we hear from eyewitnesses, we know that their memory can be faulty, the way they perceive a situation can be faulty, and there's a lot of biases along with witnessing a crime as well. And it's also difficult for the brain to take in everything, and what it doesn't take in, it tends to fill in those gaps, which really alters the reality of what particular crime happened or what they were witness to. We also know that admissions of guilt are not ironclad. So your jury tends to be heavily swayed and influenced by what they can see and experience in the courtroom. And that's why photography and photographs of the crime scene as evidence, as well as close-ups of the evidence, can be a really powerful tool in bringing the jury to the crime scene so they get to witness what you're seeing at the crime scene firsthand. If you want your photography to be admissible in court, there's some guidelines that you have to follow. For starters, you cannot disturb the crime scene. You can't walk through the crime scene. You have to make sure that you're being very careful not to step on any potential pieces of evidence, and you're not altering the crime scene as you're photographing it. You need to get a complete set of pictures. So it's important, and we'll get into exactly what types of pictures and what to take pictures of later, but it's important to make sure that you have more than enough photos. You can always go back and delete photos, but you can't go back to the crime scene and add more photos. You need to pay attention to your camera angles. Angles down or up for an object can really distort what the object looks like as well as a piece of evidence, and so you want to make sure that when you're taking pictures, you are giving it from an eyewitness viewpoint, straight from where you're looking. And it's really important as well to record all data. So every time you take a picture, you write down where it was taken and the photo number. Rule number 1 for crime scene photography: do not disturb the scene. This is a cardinal rule for crime scene photography. Your investigators that come in after the photographer and the jurors need to see the scene as it was when the first police officer arrived. If you go through and you happen to move a piece of evidence, that's going to influence how the investigators who come through right after interpret that evidence. You need to leave your scales and your labels out of your very first set of pictures. You'll take a picture without scales, and then you'll take a second picture with scales. After the scene's been photographed, you can shoot second series of pictures with minor changes. So at this point, we may go through and put our scales in or add lighting and make sure that we're getting a good shot. Rule number 2 is to get a complete set of pictures. So you have to move around the scene to see everything, so therefore you must take pictures of the scene from a bunch of different angles, or viewpoints would probably be a better way to describe that. Generally speaking, if you have an important object or a piece of evidence, it needs to appear in at least 3 pictures. The first picture needs to be an overview. This should cover the entire scene and bring out relationships between objects. It's typically good or standard to do a picture from all 4 corners of your crime scene. So you want to make sure you're getting it from every single perspective before you start to move in on the crime scene. Your mid-range shot is going to show whatever important object you're focusing on and its immediate surroundings. So you will be looking at a piece of evidence in relation to where it is in the crime scene. So you want to make sure that you're getting background as well. The close-up shows key detail for your piece of evidence. So this is where you are looking at just the piece of evidence all by itself. You're going to get details and textures. It should just be the piece of evidence that fills your frame of view. It's really important that we pay close attention to our angles. So rule number 3 is all about the angles. The relationships of size and distance can be really distorted by the wrong viewpoint. You need to shoot most pictures right at eye level. That's the height with which people normally see, and it makes it a lot easier for other people who are viewing your crime scene photographs to judge what your perspective is to view the entire crime scene. So questions you need to ask yourself: does the picture reveal the true position of the witness to the crime? Does the picture distort when I'm shooting, and am I shooting from the perspective of an observer? If you're taking a close-up of a piece of evidence, it's important to take one head-on, so at a perpendicular angle, or from directly above. What you do not want to do is to shoot up or down at the object, because what this does is it really distorts the perspective and it makes the piece of evidence look a lot different than it would in real life. Rule number 4 is to document, document, document. You need to make a sketch of where each picture was shot. I would recommend making a general outline of your crime scene, and then as you take each picture, put the number of the photo where you are standing each time you take the picture, and that way it gives you a good idea of how to line up your photo to where you were in the crime scene to give you that perspective, to bring together that whole picture, that whole crime scene. You need to write the details of each shot. If your location, your date, your time, your camera settings don't change, typically you only need to do this once, but should it ever change, you do need to make a mark of what about your photo has changed. Some court systems do put more emphasis on print film, although that is starting to go away as we are digitizing everything. However, if you do have to print photos for court, you want to make sure that you label every photo. And if you have to use negatives because you're using a 35mm camera, it's really important to label each negative as well. Crime scene photographers really have to be masters at photography. You have to have a good command of how to work your adjustable manual settings on your camera, because all your pictures need to be sharp, they need to be focused, they need to be exposed properly so you don't let in too much light or too little light. You need to frame your crime scene or your piece of evidence properly, and you have to have proper lighting. Lighting is absolutely critical in crime scene photography. The direction that the light comes will determine where your shadows fall, and shadows can be really bad in crime scene pictures because they can obscure some details, and then they can be really good if we're talking about a close-up where we're trying to see details such as the texture of a piece of cloth. You want to shine the light on that from a side view so that you can get the details of that, or if you have an impression left in mud or snow from tires or shoes, having a different type of lighting than what you normally get is going to help to accentuate what the details of that shot are. There are 3 types of lighting that we will use, and that is backlighting, side lighting, and front lighting. Backlighting is where your light source is actually behind the object that you're looking at. So your light is shining from behind the object, so as a photographer, what you are getting is a silhouette. So the front side of your object is completely dark. This is not very useful in crime scene photography. It also produces a glare when the sun is shining directly into your camera lens. Again, not very useful for crime scene photography. Side lighting can put shadows on the unlit side of the subject. For example, if your light's coming in from the side, this half of my face would be illuminated, but then this half would be in shadow. And it can be good or bad just depending upon what situation you're trying to use it for. So if you want to bring up some detail, you may want to side light so you can get that particular detail. For instance, in a footprint or a piece of cloth, that will really illuminate what the texture of that cloth is or that footprint. On the other hand, if you're just trying to take a regular picture of evidence, you've put half of that piece of evidence into shadow, so that's not very useful at all. Front lighting is where you have the light source in front of the object. Your back is to it, so the light is shining on whatever piece of evidence or object you're trying to look at. So essentially, it's considered shadowless. It is the best representation of most crime scenes. If you don't have a specific need for shadows in the crime scene, you should really consider positioning yourself so as you are getting front lighting onto your object. You want to light it from the front. If you don't have enough light at the crime scene, sometimes you will bring in artificial lighting to illuminate if it's a crime scene at night. We can also change the exposure time to brighten a photograph. So what we're doing is we're leaving the shutter open longer to allow more light in. The problem with this is if you're holding the camera, you tend to move just slightly, even though you're not trying to, and this can really blur your image. So whenever you're changing the exposure times, you need to make sure that you use a tripod so there's no movement of the camera. We can also use alternate light sources such as ultraviolet light, infrared, or fluorescent, just depending upon what our needs are. Sometimes in latent print development, you do need to use an alternative light source in order to make whatever development you're using pop out so you can see that fingerprint better.